Boa tarde a todas, a todos, a todes. Good afternoon, everyone. Please let me know if I speak too loud, because in this occasion it could happen. Welcome to the second roundtable of this 11th edition of our International Political Sociology Winter School. My name is Beto Yamato. I'm a professor here at the Institute of International Relations at PUC-Rio and one of the coordinators of the Winter School, along with our dear Professor João Pontes Nogueira. And it's my pleasure to chair this second roundtable. It is a very great pleasure to have you all here with us. As its title anticipates, this roundtable gestures, or at least simulates a gesture towards a provocation, posing the question, future without humans, question mark. As the roundtable initially contextualizes and justifies itself, the Anthropocene has made the language of planetary crisis increasingly difficult to separate from political thought. Climate disruption, mass extinction, ecological exhaustion, and technological acceleration have revived old and new debates about the end of the world. But in so doing, the roundtable also problematizes itself. But whose world is ending? And what kinds of life, agency, and coexistence might still be possible? Question mark. Hence, it repositions itself. This roundtable approaches these questions from IPS perspectives by engaging with post-human, modern human, ecological, and material perspectives on world politics. And thus, it invites us to rethink by displacing itself. Rather than asking whether humans will simply disappear, the title invites us to rethink the place of the human in a world shaped by climate systems, infrastructures, algorithms, oceans, microbes, animals, weapons, and machines. The discussion will explore then how vulnerability, responsibility, violence, and political imagination are transformed when human-centered assumptions no longer hold. For this purpose, we are extremely happy, lucky, privileged to have here with us in this roundtable dear colleagues and friends, which I now introduce to you, while thanking very much all of them for being here with us and sharing their thoughts on these provocations. So we have here Angra Claus Stephens, Associate Professor and Head of Geography at Swansea University. She's the author of 2 monographs on the politics of nationalism, National Effects, the Everyday Atmospheres of Being Political, published in 2022, and The Persistence of Nationalism from Imagined Communities to Urban Encounters, from 2013. She participated at the IPS Winter School at PUC-Rio in 2018, and has been actively involved in IPS networks for approximately 20 years now, contributing to their development through sustained international collaboration, research, and academic exchange. Angra, thank you so much for being here with us. We also have our dear Lara Salles, who is an assistant professor in the graduate and postgraduate programs in international relations at the Federal University of Uberlândia, UFU. She was a member of the editorial board of the International Feminist Journal of Politics and is currently an associate editor of IPS, International Political Sociology. She's the founder of the Mulheres Network and coordinates the Research Center on Gender, Race, and Difference in International Politics. She recently served on the Ministry of Women's International Advisory Team as the project manager for G20 affairs. And her research takes a critical look at issues such as conservatism, gender-based violence, inequality in international relations with an empirical focus on Latin America, and also includes research interests in international relations theory. Lara, thank you so much. It's always wonderful to have you here with us. And last but not least, certainly, our dear colleague and friend, Victor Lage, who is an associate professor at the Milton Santos Institute of Humanities, Arts, and Sciences, and permanent faculty member of the postgraduate program in IR at the same university, the Federal University of Bahia, UFBA. He also serves as the coordinator of the postgraduate program of IR in UFBA. He is the co-founder of the website Errante, the blog Errante, website Errante, o Internacional Fora do Lugar, and also founder and leader of the research group Interpretations of Brazil and Markers of Discrimination in Global Perspective. He's currently a rotating editor-in-chief of IPS, the International Political Sociology journal that we know all too well. So thank you very much, Victor, Lara, and Hangra. I now give the floor to you. I'll give first the floor to Lara, then to Angra, and then to Victor. Please feel free to share whatever you think and wants to think with that. Yes.
Thank you, Beto. So first of all, I'd like to thank IPS for the opportunity to be here, and especially everyone involved in the organization of this winter school, João, Beth, Marina, Francine, Chico, and everyone else, and of course also the students. Thank you for your interest, your kindness, and your enthusiasm with our class. Now here with this roundtable, and also with you, and say hi for my colleagues in the roundtable. It's a pleasure to be sharing with you this conversation. So I wrote down my intervention here to avoid rambling too much as I just did. So I will try to stick with my notes, but I will do it very quickly, I promise. When I read can you hear me? I'm too, okay, thank you. When I read the abstract outlining the proposal, sorry, let me take the time just to be in the 10 minutes. So when I read the abstract outlining the proposal for this roundtable, one phrase in particular caught my attention. And the phrase that says, and Beto just read it, rather than asking whether humans will simply disappear, the title of this roundtable invites us to rethink the place of the human in this world. So I want to start from there by highlighting this idea, the place of the human. Actually, I want to suggest a little turn in order to rephrase it as the human as a place. So I want to propose this idea of the human as a place. Of course, this is not actually quite new idea, and I will talk about it. But what I'm trying to do here is to take some distance from any essentialized idea of humanity to think it as a position. So this idea of the human as a position. This is idea that we study a lot, especially through these post-structuralist perspectives. But in that case, that this idea of position has been understood as a subject position. So a position from which one speaks, and by speaking from that position, one can reclaim a human body as a political and also an ontological category. This means that that body has so can reclaim human rights, maybe who knows a human soul, and most of all, human representation with political value. So I follow this idea, but today I want to take a different path and to suggest that humanity is not only a subject position, but maybe to invite us to think it as a more relational position. I don't know if this is exactly the expression I want. I was thinking about it and I was able to come with this idea of a relational position, but I don't know if this is what I want to say, but I will try to explain. But one that involves not only questions about the praxis and discourse involved in subjectification, but also a different set of questions. For example, what is it connected to this position? What arrangements of connections among bodies, objects, desires, even technologies make this position possible? So I'm thinking of this in this position not as a delimited space, but more as a speciality, I think. Or to use the term that we have been using during the class as an assemblage. Is assemblage the right way to say it in English? Or assemblage? Assemblage? Okay. So as an assemblage. And there's something about this assemblage that is very important for us to notice. This human assemblage moves through very particular operations of abstraction, discrimination, and universalization. So also in dialogue with the discussions we have had over the past few days, the human could be understood as a rigid line through which this assemblage is organized and stabilized. A line that has itself been territorialized. It's a difficult word, but I managed to say. And territorialized through a vast set of connections, for example, between white men, state institutions, capitalism, knowledge, etc. So the stability of this human line, of course, is not given. It's produced. But it's produced through the repetition of these relations and very specific operations. So for that human line to work, it has to follow such a machine. So perhaps it's not surprising that in this scenario, shaped by new technologies, climate change, political discourse, new political discourse, which brings new elements, new rhythm, new connections, it's not very surprising to think that this could actually destabilize and even disrupt such operations. So, um, however, it could destabilize this operation, but what have we have seen so far with these new elements, not the disappearance as this human machine, but if their intensity and maybe instability continues to grow, they could indeed make it more difficult for the human position to remain rigid or to remain stable. After all, how can this position remain rigid when the reality it helps to produce keeps escaping its control? So what may be at stake here not actually is less about the crisis of the human, but the crisis of the sovereign power produced by this machine. And this brings me to a question. So could we then understand this post-human thing as this virtual possibility of existing without a central position from which relations could be organized and stabilized? Or does this post-human point not sorry, this does the post-human point not to the destabilization of such position, but to the recomposition of sovereign in different grounds? When I think about this, what comes to my mind is that film. I don't know if you watch it. Everything, everywhere, all at once. Yes, very chaotic, right? But unlike the film, I think I could be wrong that our reality is not actually chaotic or defined by chaos. It's just defined by complexity. But the thing is, can the human position embrace complexity? Or perhaps, can it exist without the promise of stability or the fantasy of stability? My guess is yes and no. For this reason, when I think about this question, the political and analytical challenge that comes to me is twofold. One, we have to trace these new forces. We have to trace these desired machines that resist stabilization, but we also have to trace the forces that seeks to territorialize the human again as a central reference point. So this is the point where I find feminism very helpful because the feminist theory they have long draw our attention to how process of transformation contexts like this can also produce and intensify powerful paranoid tendencies. So they invite us to see how such a post-human context can actually coexist with systems of absolute belief, where meaning is expected to be fixed one and for all, defined by some kind of supreme authority, leader, God, whatever. So we can see this paranoid tendency in this emergency new cycle of consumerism, religious fundamentalism, fascist politics. So perhaps this is precisely why process like this, or moments like this, so often lead to extremely violent forms of territorializations. Take patriarchy, for example. Patriarchy has historically participated in positioning men at the center of representation, and more specifically, in positioning the white sovereign man as the majoritarian subject of humanity. And to do so, patriarchy mobilized new connections to reinstall its rigid lines. Incel, social media platforms, algorithms, these are very different types of bodies and force, new ones. Yet they can be drawn into assemblages that make patriarchal lines work. So returning to the questions posed by this roundtable about the future of a future without humans. I'm not sure that humans, or more precisely, those who have historically enjoyed the privilege of being recognized as fully human, will give up so easily of that position. So maybe the question that I would like to leave us with it is maybe the question is not whether we are moving towards the future without humans, but the question is what kind or what forms of power and what forms maybe of desire will emerge as the human loses its capacity to occupy the center. And I would think that maybe the idea of this roundtable would be for me to respond to that question, but I will stop here and try maybe to respond and during the day with the help of all of you. So thank you. And well, 10 minutes. So.
Thank you, Lara. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you. So I'll pass the floor to Angra. Thank you so much again for being here with us.
Thank you, Beto. Obrigada. Thank you, everyone, for the kind invitation to be here. Obrigada. And in Welsh, Galwas, my first language, that's diolch. We say diolch. It's really been a pleasure to be in the classroom with everyone for 3 days. That was wonderful, Lara, and it's prompted lots of things I want to say in response, but I feel I have to hold them back while I do my 10 minutes. But I'm sure there are lots of connections to draw out. But for this, I've just prepared some kind of overview of why I was interested in the end of the world, what I mean by that, and what tools might IPS offer us for thinking beyond the end of the world. So it's a mapping exercise as much as anything. So to begin, across popular culture, we might say there's this prevailing collective mood that we're living at the end of the world. Novels about totalitarianism, video games about pandemics, films about climate collapse, all gesture towards this shared structure of feeling, what Raymond Williams once called the structure of feeling. While many scholars critically engage these apocalyptic imaginaries, both in relation to the Anthropocene and the idea of the end of a liberal, rules-based international order. There's much talk now about the potential end of that. There's, at the same time, growing interest in policy, the arts, and in academia, in repair and how people live on after crisis, creatively adapting under constraints. So in the seminars this week, I've been trying to ask, how do we critically understand and historicize some of the ideas about the end of the world that are circulating? What are their implications for how we read and engage current events, political and environmental? And what other concepts and stories might we uncover for imagining how we repair and live otherwise? So let's start with what the problem is and what we're trying to think against, perhaps. So in one of the readings, I shared Jacques Derrida talks about the end of the world, meaning imagining the end of all humanity, so humanity as a whole. And that's what's posed by the nuclear question, this possibility of imagining the end of humanity as a whole. And what I picked up on the most in that article of his was how he said that this is, by definition, therefore, a question for the humanities to deal with this question of humanity. And he goes on to say that even when literature doesn't explicitly engage this question, such as science fiction does perhaps, or apocalyptic books, in some ways, all fiction engages this question. All fiction and all literature is about this question of being human. So that's one definition of what we're trying to think about, but Professor Jeff Huysmans provides a more useful, perhaps, definition of end thinking in a recent-ish article from 2 years ago, where he says end thinking means reading life from a heightened awareness of its ending. It means structuring politics through a series of oppositions, leaving us thinking that either we have to act or we will fail. It leads us to these extreme positions. So thinking differently requires loosening some of those anxieties, making it possible to think in between this all or nothing. So to begin the work of thinking outside of end thinking, we need to start with some ideas about time. And of course, IPS has been engaging alternative ideas of time from its very beginning. So end thinking tends to produce a linear developmental view of time. And this has implications for how we imagine environmental futures, but also all other kinds of futures. But the environmental one has captured the interest of many geographers, but also critical international relations theorists. There are some great articles on this in the 20th anniversary issue of the IPS journal. In other work in IR, Carl Death has written about how climate policies are often developed in depoliticized linear versions of universal homogeneous time. Delph Roth concurs that the time of the Anthropocene proceeds straightforwardly in a standardized way for all as part of a secular eschatology. Davis and Todd have said that we have to understand the time of the Anthropocene alongside the time of colonization. Mitchell and Chowdhury argue that ideas about human extinction can appear to be predominantly concerned with protecting the future of whiteness. A similar article is developed by Matilda Fitzmaurice in the 20th anniversary issue of IPS as well. So the point is that these diagnoses of a closed environmental future have significant implications because they not only talk about how the present is constituted, but suggest what kind of future is possible and impossible. So in a recent article where I made my way through some of these climate literatures and debates, I have argued that these ideas about the end times supported by linear time also have connections with nationalist thought. This is perhaps not surprising, but it surprised me to find, oh, I thought I was onto a new project and I'm back to thinking about nationalism again. Nationalist thought is what I refer to describe broader ideas about who we are and how we understand our place in the world. They emerge alongside the nation in the Enlightenment period, but they include ideas about past, present, and future as ordered according to a story of development, but also about the modern subject that Lara describes that stands at the center of the world and is able to shape it in invariably his image. So thinking about beyond end times means taking on these kinds of ideas that are familiar to us also from nationalist thought. And what I've been introducing in the seminars and with the students' help this week, where they've given me so many more ideas to think about, and I'm grateful to that. We've been looking at how in engaging with the affective atmospheres of everyday life, starting from the middle of everyday life, might help us to unfurl some other imaginings of futures. Which I write here, sit between the desire to change the world and yet refusing to be defeated by it. So hopefully we can uncover some other ideas about subjectivity that are not as strong as that modern subject Lara outlined for us, not as strong and determined and sovereign, but also not willing to give up on the world either. So how does IPS offer us some ways forward? IPS is obviously not one thing, but it does share some common focus points, and I'm sketching out 4 here, and I'll develop the 4th one a little bit, and then I'll finish. The first point is obviously the relentless focus on the international. And that is a really special thing that comes with this body of work, because, and I can say that coming from a geography department where all the geographers are dealing with the world, with all parts of the world every day. They go everywhere. I have to sign off health and safety forms for my colleagues going to Antarctica, everywhere in the world. but really is the world or the international the central object of study. They are an expert in Delhi or in Norway or in the forests of Brazil. I have colleagues who come here to study the forests and so on. There's the specialization of different places, but not looking at the international as a whole. So that's a different focus that comes with IPS. Two, as Nigoir and Postmans have written, IPS prioritizes a transversal approach, looking across cities and sites, looking between them. And this is a method that replaces the privileging of depth of knowledge with a method that instead looks between here and there. And this is also different to a comparative logic, because as Nigoir and Husmans explain, it also carries with it a critique of the inside-outside logic, the transversal thinking. Third, IPS approaches raise questions about the relationship between knowledge and power. So always questioning institutionalized knowledge, but also from its very beginning, paying attention to other forms of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, or the knowledge of the street, women's knowledge, the knowledge of the home, the forms of expertise. So fourth, and this is the one I want to emphasize here, is perhaps to take the sociological seriously in IPS too. And IPS does this in its focus and celebration of everyday life. And this focus on everyday life, let me be clear, is not developing through privileging real people's voices. And that is always a risk or a trap, I think. This is not about it being, again, going into more depth through people, to refuse that ontology of depth. But instead, shattering universals by starting from the middle and with how people live. And as Emma McCluskey has shown in her work, this means appreciating also that those moments will combine love and care with exclusion and violence. It will invariably be all of this stuff mixed together. So using affective approaches, I'm interested in how we trace the connections between these big global challenges and people's daily struggles and lives. What methods allow us to look at that, the way they play out in everyday life, as well as being big ideas that we hear about on our screens or from the news. And just a few more points to finish it out. Okay, have I taken 10 minutes already? So affect theory helps us by appreciating how the present unfolds in a multiplicity of ways. It's about attending to the multiplicity of the present. So breaking with linear ideas of time, but also furthermore, through the work of Lauren Berlant this week, and also Ben Anderson and Anna Sekor, we've been looking at how this literature is interested in thinking about this moment of what it means to live after what they call after the loss of the future, or Lauren Berlant calls it after the loss of good life fantasies. And I think we agreed in the classes that this was a sort of shared structure of feeling, again, of our times, that we cannot, if ever we were able to believe, and certainly for some communities, these were never open and realizable fantasies. But let's say that even more people now fail to believe perhaps the fantasy of upward mobility, economic growth, meritocracy, the promise of a university degree, of a career, of heterosexual marriage, whatever promises that were once given to hold social worlds together. that there is a shattering of these around us. Of course, we can say that this suggests a certain first world perspective, but in watching a little clip of Parasite film today, Korean film, that won the Oscar, the first Oscar to be won by a non-English language film. I think we see how that dream of progress is shared internationally, and the loss of that dream, how that plays out internationally as well. So I've been interested in asking, how do people endure, how do people adapt and get through in a way that allows for them to continue to attach to life? And how can we think about ways of getting by without opting for the dominant images of heroic saviours on the one hand, or hapless victims on the other hand? How do we chart some resources for other subjectivities, other ways to understand what it means to belong? But also I'm interested in what it means to participate in the world around us, so to act. And I'm interested in that in my own work through methods that include attuning to micro-level encounters, practices, attitudes, habits, outlooks, how these are learned and challenged on the ground. Perhaps we can talk more about methods later. But for now, I'll just conclude by saying that this is about sort of appreciating the ordinariness of crisis. And so thinking about how we think again about resilience and resistance against the backdrop of nihilistic times.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thanks so much for sharing with us your thoughts. And now, Victor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Boa tarde, good afternoon, everyone. I'll begin with the thank yous, so don't count this on my time. So thank you first, João, Beto, Francine, Chico, Marina, Jeff, and Bruno for organizing this project at the IPS Winter School, which is fantastic. Actually, this is the third time I'm here offering a workshop. In the first two editions, I was a student at the Winter School, so it's really great to be here again. I also thank Núcleo's team, Cláudia, Isabelle, Clara, and Luana. Being a university that there is no núcleo, I know how important it is a núcleo for making this logistically possible, so thank you. And finally, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and Harriet, Beto, and Lara. I admire your work very much, and Lara is one of the most important references to me. So I prepared some notes that I'll read. Actually, I had already begun reading, as you realized. So I'm going to read to be on time and also to be less nervous. So I want to begin the talk I prepared for today by saying that it seems to me that one possible, maybe straightforward entry point to the question, the title of this roundtable, A Future Without Humans, is to put into question itself what one means by human in the singular and humans in the plural, as Lara and Beto already anticipated. So, and also, it's obviously the case that a future without humans is not necessarily the future of the world. It is also the case that this future would be the end of a certain world, and this is not exactly bad, or maybe of certain worlds in the plural. But then, as Beto questioned in the first place, which world or worlds would end if a certain conception of the human ends? And whose world or worlds? And more, with the end of this world, or end of this conception of the human, would the international also end? Of course, it is impossible to unfold these questions here, but I want to at least share some reflections and certain lines of problematization to these questions. As you can note, I take the end of the world, the end of the human, and the end of the international as entangled ends. So the first part will be, I'll make some statements, a bit rough, but they serve as a series of assumptions to the point that I'm going to make in the second part. So with these statements, I want to suggest that while a critique of Eurocentrism and the West is still important and necessary, this critique is proving increasingly insufficient to address questions such as the one in the title of this roundtable and the ones I have just posed. So 4 statements. First, countries such as Brazil, China, Russia occupy far from obvious positions in the face of the so-called crisis of the liberal international order, or what Michael Williams has recently shown that could also be understood as the crisis of the conservative international order. These countries occupy at least ambivalent positions when one thinks of terms such as West or Euro-America, and perhaps even when one thinks about modernity. Not to mention the position of these nation states in relation to the ambivalent and very heterogeneous positions of these nation states in relation to contemporary rearticulations of global capitalism. So when we consider these states and their heterogeneous historical formation and recent reconfiguration, a critique of the West and of Eurocentrism is clearly incapable of fully grasping the contemporary reordering of the international. Second statement. In the last decades, one has been witnessing the proliferation of instances in which an anti-colonial, an anti-Western, and even a decolonial vocabulary has been mobilized by different political agents in different parts of the world, state agents and non-state agents alike, to sustain political projects that are deepening the subalternization of internal minorities. This does not mean, of course, that the anti-colonial and decolonial approaches themselves are to be blamed. Neither does it mean that these approaches are not also mobilized by political projects fighting subalternization or seeking to cultivate alternative pluriversal or even decolonial worlds. My point is rather that, as it happens, for instance, with the notion of intersectionality, the anti-colonial and decolonial vocabularies are increasingly subject to intense dispute and are not straightforward with regard to their analytical and political mobilization. The journal IPS, by the way, has recently published a collective discussion reflecting precisely on the mobilization of anti-colonial language in authoritarian and conservative projects. Third statement. The widespread differentiation within and beyond academic circuits between the so-called class politics and the so-called identity politics seems to me a profoundly misleading way of problematizing contemporary transformations of power relations and the production of subjectivities. This differentiation is certainly not new. One could recall, for example, the late 90s controversies around the notions of recognition and redistribution, involving names such as Honneth, Fraser, and Butler. But anyway, this differentiation between a so-called class politics and a so-called identity politics is currently mobilized sometimes. The way this is currently mobilized sometimes conflates what is to be analyzed with the framework of analysis. That is to say, the distinction between class politics and identity politics, rather than being the analytical framing point, deserves even more to be analyzed in terms of its catastrophic political implications, not the least of which the obstacles it has been posing to political alliances, to broader political alliances. Conceptually, this differentiation is often weak in terms of its definition both of class and of identity. Finally, fourth statement. One of the most instigating dimensions of contemporary theorizations is situated, in my view, precisely in the attempts to rethink conceptually and politically the possibility of making alliances, not despite irreconcilable ethical, political, and sometimes ontological differences, but across these differences. While one could claim, correctly in my view, that some of the most insightful critical theorizations from the 60s to the 90s, maybe to the early 2000s, were devoted to a radical critique of universalism, mainly in its Eurocentric and Western variations, and to a radical critique of perspectives positing materialist and class relations as determinants in the last instance of power relations and of the production of subjectivities, I think we have been seeing in the last decades fascinating attempts to rethink the possibilities for the cultivation of the common, for instance, in Achille Mbembe's work, or of a pluriverse or decolonial politics, and for advancing other internationalisms, for instance, in the conceptual work and political activism of Black and Indigenous internationalisms. Here, however, one should be careful not to conflate the conceptual problematization of power relations and the production of subjectivities with laying out an ethical or a normative position. Both are equally necessary, a conceptual problematization and a normative and ethical framework, but they are also irreducible to each other. The difference between a conceptual problematization and a normative and ethical position seems to me to be more important than ever. So, having made these statements, in the few minutes I will highlight just one aspect that, in my view, traverses them all. To rethink the place of the human, as the description of this roundtable invites us to do, requires rethinking not only what one means by the human, as Lara puts it, but also what one means by the world. Or more precisely, which notions of the human and of the world one would like to cultivate, and which notions one would be ready to see disappear, or even actively participate in putting an end to. The intimate connection between a certain conception of the human and a certain conception of the world has been persistently discussed by names such as Derrida, Foucault, Winter, Mbembe, Walker, and Denise Ferreira da Silva, just to name those that were more immediately with me while preparing these notes. They all have very different approaches to the problem, but converge on the fact that any problematization of this intimate connection between the human and the world is also a problematization of the limits of the modern human, that is, the relation of a universalizing conception of humanity and its others, and the problematization of the limits of the modern world, that is, the relation of modernity and its others. To Sylvia Winter, for instance, the contemporary world remains deeply marked by what Michel Foucault discussed as the invention of man. According to Winter, the production of the rational man in the first decisive moment of the formation of the modern world was inseparable from the production of his others, whether these were dispossessed indigenous peoples or the enslaved peoples brought from the African continent. In its second moment of imperial expansion, Sylvia Winter argues that the biologizing conception of man turned the descendants of the African in interworlds into the ultimate referent of the human other racially inferior, I'm quoting her, assimilating to varying degrees other non-white colonized peoples to this category. These reconfigurations of man are understood by Winter as processes of overrepresentation, which make a specific conception of the human being stand in what, by definition, would be the legitimate and superior way of being human. All other modes of being human thereby become inferior to this modern overrepresentation. Actually, we could also remind that all other living and non-living entities become inferior to this modern overrepresentation. This modern overrepresentation exposes a certain universalizing move of this conception of man that is inseparable from what Rob Walker identified as an aporia between the individual, the state, and the modern system of states. According to him, to Walker, and you know this argument well, I guess, the full realization of the universality of the human condition in modernity has historically depended on the implementation of the particularity of the citizen condition under the authority of the modern state. At the same time, this authority has proven inseparable from the operation of certain conditions of possibility under which certain political lives and forms of coexistence are considered legitimate, while others are qualified as barbaric and non-modern. To put it differently, the overrepresentation of man, as if it were the human itself, as Winter claims, is intimately connected to the overrepresentation of the modern state and the system of the modern states, as if they compose the only possible way of conceiving an entirely legitimate political community. These two processes of overrepresentation should not be seen as merely analogous, they are rather imbricated in each other. a parenthesis here, one could move even further and point out that capitalism also works through a process of overrepresentation, as we can think in those contemporary reinterpretations of the Marxian notion of primitive accumulation, as, for example, the interpretation of Henri Callier and Maurício Lazarato. And once more, at stake here is not an analogy, but an imbrication, without precedence or determination in the last instance, of multiple processes of overrepresentation. In the face of these mutating and multiple processes of overrepresentation, I take the description of this roundtable, which invite us to think how, I quote, vulnerability, responsibility, violence, and political imagination are transformed when human-centered assumptions no longer hold, end of quote. I take this description as an invitation to further problematize the notion of the human in our human-centered the notion of the human in our human-centered assumptions, the notion of the world when we refer to a contemporary world, as well as the notion of international when we situate ourselves in dialogue with international political sociology. So climate systems, infrastructures, algorithms, oceans, microbes, animals, weapons, and machines, these are things that are mentioned in the description of this roundtable, are certainly redefining the limits of the world, of the international, and of the human, as well as their implications. Actually, things, non-human living entities, natural phenomena, and supernatural entities have always shaped the international, the world, and the human, despite the fact that our most widely known traditions of knowledge have been, until recently, unequipped to understand it. Actually, Lara's course today, her 2025 text in Global Studies Scholarly, which I highly recommend, and her speech now made me realize that I need to be more complex about it, but I'll try. Made me realize that I need to tackle other complexities of these human assemblages of what William Connolly has called an ecology of non-human modes of production. Moreover, we know well by now that other non-Western indigenous traditions of knowledge have been conceiving the importance of non-human living entities, natural phenomena, and supernatural entities for centuries. So to be clear, I'm not saying that, of course, I'm not saying that we need to dismiss the importance of European traditions of knowledge, and also that there is no point in criticizing Eurocentrism or the West. To be fair, many European traditions of knowledge have been crucial to the task of problematizing them. At the same time, the understanding of how things, non-human living entities, natural phenomena, supernatural entities, have always shaped the world, the international, and the human, requires a radical problematization of our taken for granted assumptions of what we mean by these terms, world, human, and international. So to conclude, my wager is that this kind of radical problematization can also be helpful in overcoming the reproduction of dichotomies, analytical and political, such as modern, non-modern, West, non-West, class identity, and also global South, global North. These dichotomies, in my view, are part of the problem rather than being a fruitful analytical path towards the understanding of the contemporary definitions of the world, the human, and the international, and their implications. Moreover, these dichotomies can prove to be obstacles to the task of rethinking possible alliances towards the cultivation of a common or of a pluriverse composed of ultimately irreconcilable, but nonetheless coexisting conceptions of the human of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Vitor. Thank you, Lara. Thank you, Andrea. We now can open the floor to commentaries, questions, interventions, further thoughts from here, but also there. I see Marina has already one intervention. Maybe we can collect a couple. Bruna, what's your name again, sorry? Emerson. So maybe we start with these three and then go around and So, Marina, Bruna, Anderson.
Is it fun? It is. First of all, thank you so much. I'm gonna avoid like gushing over everything you just said because that's what I wanted to do. But I'm trying to stay in course. I wanted to hear the three of you, or four, if you may, Beto, speak more on the overrepresentation of men in this, not specifically in the modern system of state, but this, because I think it's been like a red thread throughout the three your three contributions. This overrepresentation of a very specific subject, male, white, Western, and as Angarad mentioned, the Mitchell and Chaudhry piece, then I was thinking like how we can imagine like other subjects and other times, other ends of the world through these relational positions that Lana said. I just wanted to hear like more stories, um more subjects, more subjectivity, not more subjects, but more subjectivities on this end of the world. That was and if I could maybe just have a comment. I'm working on the idea of the Anthropocene and of the humans differentiating themselves, as Vita said, from other beings in the planet through intelligence. And we got that with Adam, and in Christian mythology, we have that with Prometheus. In Greek mythology, we have that everywhere. And that may be a question for us with AI. That seems to be a question for us with AI, because if we differentiate ourselves by being the intelligent species, if we have intelligent machines, then what are we then? And what does it make us in the world? What space does it leave us in the world? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marina. Bruna and Emerson.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being clearly and speaking slowly. It was important to work some thoughts. So I have four questions. It's for all of you. You can choose one or even respond and reward. So is it possible to contest and create new imaginaries of the ends of the world rather than merely responding to this cries of neoliberal world paradigm through something else than the identity? I mean, the identity is important for us to translate ourselves, our demands, our flags, to reivindicate or not reivindicate some kind of new worlds, new waters, new imaginaries, new human beings. And that's going to the second question. How can we translate ourselves into these worlds when we already did before, trying to be recognized as a fully human, that we are not, or in my case, in Panon's thought case, we are not fully seen and recognized as human bodies. And when we are trying to claim the neoliberal thought, for example, say that see and hear us through the identities, but our identities has been distorted, cooptated, commodified into marketable and commodities, and without a meaningful redistribution politics. It's just the false o falso dualismo entre reconhecimento e redistribuição, que não gera representação. Então, como entrar nesse debate entendendo que não é só algo falso, né? Algo que é um ou outro, mas é os dois, both and both redistribution and recognition. And in this sense, should we be contesting the idea of human and see us about bodies and territories, but our territorial bodies and territories are constantly violated and disrespected? Lara, a gente está sempre sendo desafiadas, violentadas, contestadas, como reivindicar esse corpo-território que não é visto nem como corpo, nem como território, mas como se ver como tal nesse processo de subjetivação, de agenciamento e de tentar se entender nesses mundos morrendo. E to pass the word and finish my little questions at the level of everyday life, where the life and the world are constantly produced and reproduced by women and Black women and the South Global women, etc. How might we think through the in-between thinking, or even in a condition of being more than survival and less than trading? When we are struggling not only against death itself, but against hunger, melancholia, sadness, rage, and the huge lack of time and material and immaterial conditions necessary to create new desires and new identities. Thank you so much. Sorry for this long.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Emerson. I'm from the law department. I'm a master's student. And first of all, I have to say that this discussion makes me feel more anxious than ever, principally because I feel that we are always running in circle when we are discussing topics like international relations and Anthropocene and colonialization. And my research is concentrated in the legitimacy of the international law, principally to talk about reparations for crimes against humanity. And I link this legitimacy thing to the rule of law, to the human rights and democracy. And what I perceive in this debate of the end of the world is that we have to look to the plutocracy that is making our institutions poisoned our institutions and leading them away from the principal standards of human rights, democracy, the rule of law. And I always want to join the global color line to this debate, the boys in this debate, because I think it's very important to think how this global color line is affecting white people day by day, more constantly. And Nancy Fraser says it in her book, talking that the work, the exploitation of the white worker is getting similar to the exploitation of the black worker. So how in the era of that we are losing our rights and we are constantly facing the changing of this global color line, and we are having each more disagreement, even more disadvantages. How can we as international relations students can relate these concepts to the end of the world, to the end of humanity. Principally thinking that these plutocratics are already colonizing the space, for example.
Thank you, Anderson. So maybe we can go in a different direction, or is there another? No. Let's respond, and then we can open for another set of questions and provocations, interventions. Yes. Angra, would you like to go first, or I can respond to at least one or two of the questions, so you have time to think. In thinking about this roundtable, I prepared some notes, but I'll not use it. I tend to think initially in two or three moves. One, which is more intuitive, is to think about the words used. So future, human, world, and so on and so forth. In order, of course, to question which language, which grammar, which world does it come from? For example, to adapt or to paraphrase Chakrabarty's question once, he asked, where is the now? I would question, where is the human? Where is the future? In a sense, kind of proposing a radical provincialization of these words, concepts, and the language and worlds that come with it, right? So responding to Marina and possibly to Emerson, I tend to go back to a certain reading of the politics of language and translation, when of course language here is not opposed to materiality, right? But it's fundamentally related to a certain form of world making. I'm thinking particularly in how, for example, in one particular chapter, Chakrabarty talks about different forms of world translations and the relationship between colonialism and that. And that relates to the notion of universal middle terms and how, for example, many of the words that we use, even critically, participate in a grammar, in a language, and thus in a certain form of world making and world remaking. And it's hard to think without words, without language, without grammars and conceptual matrix that we always are caught within, right? A second move is to, of course, contextualize this, I think, before what I understood Victor was inviting, which is to think the relation of this to the pluriverse or a broader conception of the common. And finally, just to take issue and draw attention to one point that is particularly dear to me, is to think about relations and what's the very notion in the middle of the phrase, a future without humans, what without means, what me without provoke us or maybe enable us to think, how can be a without? How can be a relation between without and all the things that out involves? What does with means? Because I think that there is something in the with that may be important to think what makes, for example, reverse possible, even as imagination. But then, just to conclude, apologies if I'm taking too long. One question that this kind of problematics has been posing and reposing to me is then the problem of, to paraphrase the way Spivak puts in a famous piece, how can you reconcile this with a certain macro logics, macro politics that would have to face the problem of translation understood very broadly in relation to world making? So just to give some numbers. according to UNESCO Atlas of Languages, we used to have 8,000 languages. We now have some more than 7,000 languages alive in the world. We lose one language every 2 weeks. By the end of 2100, we'll, in the optimistic view, lose more than half, or according to the pessimists, more than 90% of the languages. What that speaks to the discussions about what we are thinking today. Thank you.
I'll just develop two points in sort of conversation with all the questions that are wonderful, and I can't do full justice to them. But first, on imaginations and overrepresentation of man, I just wanted to throw in two books that I've been enjoying a lot. And those are Bonnie Honig's A Feminist Theory of Refusal. And I also mentioned in the seminar today, Adriana Cavarero's book, Inclinations. And this speaks back to some of Lara's points and Victor's points about imagining a more relational understanding of subjectivities. And Cavarero has a go at what she calls the upright figure in Western philosophy, the mostly man that stands up, puts himself apart from the world. And then she goes through all sorts of other gestures from everyday life of caring relations to try and tease out other images of what it means to stand up or to put an arm around another or be together with others. And I'm really inspired by that book, and it's cited by Honig in her Feminist Theory of Refusal. And then another just anecdote in response to Emerson's work question as well as the two others. Another book I want to throw in the mix. This year, on this theme of the end of the world, I was introduced to Ray Bradbury's novel, Fahrenheit 451. I don't know if you've read it, if it's big in Brazil. It turns out, I think it's read by all students in the USA, but not so. Fahrenheit 451. I read it because I went to see a theatre production which was based on the book, and the theatre production was called Burn, Burn, Burn. And because they were doing a version of the book, I thought, oh, I better read the book then. And it's a marvelous book, and it's based on the idea of a fireman working for the local city fire service. And if he hears that there's a house with books, they go immediately out in the van and set fire to the books to eliminate all books from the city, because books are so dangerous and they're being completely outlawed. So people have to hide books in their attics, and this man, that's his everyday 9 to 5 job, is to go out and burn books. And it's funny and weird and striking. But you were talking about intelligence as what kind of remains with humans. Well, that's a fantasy that we have. But I think what comes through in that novel is that what's dangerous about humans is that they feel things and that they're creative. And that's what these firefighters are put in charge of eliminating, because humans are dangerous when they think too much or question things or come at things from another perspective. And in getting rid of books, they're trying to reduce the bandwidth of social life to make sure people follow the rules and all behave the same. And they go around with their little earpieces, you know, where the government tells them what to do. So whenever I see my daughter with her AirPods in, I say, oh, it's what, Fahrenheit 451. She's just following the rules. But anyway, this was a really striking novel that I'm still trying to make sense of, and I'm throwing into the mix as another creative engagement with the end of the world.
Thank you, Andrea. Lara?
Really, Joel, I'm like thinking with you now because I have no idea what I'm about to say. But I'm gonna say something. Let's see what's gonna be. Just trying to engage with Marina's question about the over-representation of men. And then you ask, how can we imagine other subjects or other types of representations of this men? If this is attached to the idea of intelligence or no, etc. And what I was thinking is that although I really agree that this over-representation of men is a very important question or issue for us, I think that maybe we are too attached to one question that this problem raises, which is what the man, what the man is, right? What we are trying to understand, what is the man? What is a better question, right? So this over-representation is trying to dispute the multiple meanings of being man. But maybe, and maybe this is not the only question, because when we are too attached to this idea of meaning of man or maybe representations of man, sometimes it could be the intelligence now, and from years, maybe last year would not be intelligent, but other signifier or other idea that would represent this man. So maybe the question is not so much about what is this man and how can we represent it in other ways or not over-represented it, but what this man can do, this over-represented man, what it can do, but well, what this idea can do. And what this idea can do is something that we have actually mentioned. I think that it can distinguish, discriminate, universalize, it can promote some segmentation. So no matter with what type of idea or signifier or signification, the thing is that we'll be able to do the things, this operation, and have been able to do that. So maybe the question would be, how can we stop this operation? The things that this man can do. How can we stop this universalization, this segmentation, stratification? So I'm trying to have an answer for that. How can we stop this operation? I think that we have some cases that, and now I'm trying to dialogue with Bruna. I don't know if I understand very well, but maybe the question Bruna was asking is something related with that. Is, do we need identity at all? Do we have to fight over representations? Especially if these representations are always falling again in this operation of universalization, segmentation, and so on, so forth. Do we need fight for this identity? And I think I don't know if it's a question of need, but we have to, because this over-representation of men and this fight against identity is something that follows the logic of other important political subjects, that is the state, for example, or this multiple sovereign actors that we have. So they actually made us to follow the lead and to follow and again repeat this idea of a very sovereign operation of identity. So it's the operation of power. They make us to follow this kind of machine again. So the idea how to stop it. I think that we can only do that in other environments that are not actually colonized by this very specific power. So maybe even being too sense común, to common sense, but when we think about these indigenous women, when we think about acampamento Terra Livre, when we think about these manifestations where they are trying to deal with their questions through other operation of identities. They are talking not in terms of I am this, I'm that, but what actually make us share some experiences? How can we actually be? We are all affected by the same thing, and how our body and our territory they could be thought together, and how this body and territory can work through other operations, and by that this body territory can do things that the body, as we thought, cannot. So he can think about politics in a different way. He can make produce association in different way. They actually can imagine agendas differently. Their agenda are not individual agendas. They are not thinking about individual rights. They are trying to actually do another thing. So trying to summarize what I said. Right. I'm just trying to say that if we can think about a different kind of when we are dealing with these bodies, a man body, a woman body, this body territory, and we ask what they can do. Maybe when we change this connection, they can do things differently. And in a way, the grammar will change as well as a consequence. I don't know if I put myself here because I was trying to think at the same time I was talking. So maybe I will consolidate this idea further when I have more time.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Marina, Emerson, and Bruna. I'm a kind of a slow thinker, so I just have some very sparse notes. First, I agree with everything Lara said, and I'll just want to pick up on this interruption of over-representation to make a comment on that. Because I think that to maybe foster the interruption of this over-representation, two things are crucial, I would say. First, to understand the complexity of the processes of over-representation. They are really not simple processes. When we think through them, we very often see ourselves reproducing them and not only fighting them. So I think that one of the very important things is to understand not only practices of resistance, of counterconduct, or even a revolution, if that exists, but the complexity of these processes. Lara showed in her class today how complex these processes of overrepresentation is empirically, conceptually, analytically. And the second thing is to enlarge our repertoires, our conceptual repertoires, our traditions of knowledge, you know? And I think that today, 2026, is not convincing more, it's not, no English. It's not anymore?
Not yet.
Not yet? No, not yet? No.
No longer.
Não mais, é isso.
No more.
Eu nem português eu sabia. It's no longer convincing, something that we often read in the beginning of text, that the international relations discipline has not talked about race or indigenous people. No, it's not the case. That we have 20 years of traditions of thinking talking about race, maybe 20 or 30 years talking about indigenous knowledges and thinking. Of course, it's getting increasingly present, but I think that this is just building a scarecrow, building a scarecrow, and doesn't make the job of interacting with these words. So we all know that knowledge is collective. We all know that traditions of knowledge are erased. And anytime one writes, we don't talk about race in IR, is erasing this 20-year at least, but maybe more. If we take Roxanne 1993 text, maybe 33 years of people talking about race. And of course, gender even more, sexuality, and so on. So enlarging our repertoires within and beyond IR, I think it's important to think ways of interrupting this overrepresentation. And the third thing, there is this famous 2001 Sankaran Krishna text on the amnesia in IR, right? Where he argues that there was back then, maybe now, a kind of virtuosity in students in IR when they talk about abstractions, and that this virtuosity is erasing from the discipline the history of colonialism, of theft of land, and so on. Krishna also says that its abstractions are inevitable, but he is complaining about the political virtuosity of talking about abstractions. I think that in these last decades, there is another danger in what seems sometimes to be a political virtuosity of avoiding abstractions. For me, it's unbelievable. Avoiding abstractions there as something that would be politically virtuous. So I'll go to Bruna's comment now very briefly. Not because I don't have time, but because I don't know to go on that. But I wrote the following paragraph while you were posing your question. But it's, I wrote too fast, and it's kind of dangerous to expose something. You know? There is no hunger, no deeply violent death, no perverse material inequality that is not intimately connected to very abstract notions of the human and of political community. And as Lara proposes in her works, also linked to fantasies and desires. So sometimes, I'm not saying you said that, but sometimes it seems that material dimensions are urgent and immaterial dimensions are not, or abstract things are not. But both are both are equally urgent. So on identity, I think that on the one hand, on identity, there is a very abstract thing. Identity is very abstract with obviously material implications that are deadly sometimes, but also very important at others. I would say that identity is something that we cannot not want, but we cannot just want. It is as indispensable as it is problematic. So if we think, for instance, of notions as new humanity in Fanon that you mentioned, or in the becoming black of the world, not only to understand the advancement of precarity in Mbembe, but also the possibilities of cultivating other humanities, or in his last book, Terrestrial Community, the possibility of cultivating other commons, or even Lélia Gonzalez in the early 80s. She has a text that is fantastic, where she's already closer to psychoanalysis. And then she claims, what I'm looking for is not something different, is another reason, but in the very capital R notion of reason. So these are all ways, I would say, that cultivate a kind of what Spivak called strategic essentialism, but knowing first and foremost that is strategic, provisional, and that political projects need to cultivate this is strategic essentialism, but maybe with a horizon of dissolution identity. But it's always a horizon. I would say something like that.
Thank you, Victor. We have passed more than 10 minutes of our panel. I'm tempted to resist the end of time, but I don't know if anyone would have a last commentary or intervention, maybe in the panel, or Jeff, and what's your name? Neuma. So let's close with Neuma and then Jeff.
Because Emerson, the question with that, I didn't know how to answer that. But maybe you can talk better later.
Please, no.
I will make just a comment. I think that it's very difficult to talk about the end of the world because the world is improving technology, medicine, and it's very difficult to think as a research. AI, it isn't to substitute the human people because the AI will only help human people work in the future, building projects and helping the machine, the system machine, or talk about assembly the system of computer. You talk about the assembly. Assembly, yes, yeah. In the past, I'm an accountant and I'm postgraduate in sociology, politics and culture, and management and audit, government audit. And my graduate, I had the specialized in computer, the old computer, sistema antigo do computador, the long assembly, basic, and then the time when we talk about the language system computer. And I think that it's very difficult to talk about the world because we have the world is improving knowledge, technology, the system of health. It maybe human people could be better in the future and didn't finish. Okay, in this in my view. Okay.
Thank you. Jeff, please.
Thank you. Then we'll have a question or a comment. It was already said that a world without humans. It depends what humans mean. But let's say part of this question of the planetary Anthropocene, the militarians, and so on, comes on the back of the humans as a species. There's a biological one. Now, if you think about evolution, biological evolution, why would we care about the ending of a species? The species will most likely end at some point in the future. And I'm wondering if you take the position about, it's a kind of provocative, it's not a provocative position, but just an observation. So it will end and start from there. Then actually, we might actually be released from being put into the question that the most important question for us is the ending of the species, which then I think would open up the more important question, which is who is mobilizing, in which kinds of contestations, all these references to the ending of the world and the ending of humanity. And that is a diversity of people and diversities of contexts, and I don't think they're unified, but it would open up, you can start to use Maris concept, how these things are assembled around the ending and what's going on. This is a different question because there is something to this question that you pulled in. And so we have to diversify between what human is going to be ended, who is going to be ended, da, da, da. But there is an element also about these elements, imageries, visuals, affectional pools, and so on, are mobilized by and in specific context and in a diversity. It's not one as well. And so I think that would be an interesting agenda to open up because it would be the more political sociological agenda about how is this operating at the moment. And the second question I have, but I think I know Victor's answer to this is, but just as a thought provocation, there is also an element embedded in, if you do the question back as a questioning of the formulation of the statement. It's a bit awkward, but say, what if you would refuse to be pulled in the way you understand politics? That you would be pulled into thinking the world and being pulled into thinking human and humanity, rather than just a problem, and see how there are certain configurations that play in relation to a problem, without having to pull it into humanity and into the world. So you speak always about universalizing of the world. And so I have to speak very close to this thing. So it's the second element about the refusal. The question is about refusal of the statement. And the statement is a pulling into the humanity and a pulling into the world. That's the way to do politics.
Refuse this statement, you mean?
Yeah, you refuse the pull that's implicit in the statement. So politics is about pulling to the world and pulling to humanity, or questioning whether that's possible to go there. But you could refuse and just talk about states somewhere, somehow.
Talking about states.
Or something else. Yeah, I think about states then, or contests, or issues.
States, not states.
States, yeah, not states. Yeah, states. S-T-A-K.
States.
States, other states, other
Yeah,
states.
not the state. I don't think about the state. There's enough thinking about the state.
I think your English must get better.
Vai?
Eu?
Eu mesmo.
So Neumann, thanks for your question. I'm not sure I agree with the assumption that things will get better, but I do think that what will happen is an open question. So of course, this relation between humans and technology can improve a lot of things, but it can also move things towards catastrophic consequences. So I think this is very open to dispute. And even certain areas in which we think that this is an improvement, for instance, of course, the use of technology is improving a lot of practices in companies, enterprises. This improvement, seen from another perspective, can be also very catastrophic because it's improving also their capacity to destroy many things or appropriate many things. So I'm not saying it's necessarily the case. I'm just saying that this relation is a bit in dispute, this relation between humans and technology. Not to mention that sometimes we assume that technology is something human-made, which is not necessarily the case if we think of other traditions of knowledge. That technology, if we think technology as a knowledge that is applied, it's not necessarily human-made. So this very assumption that technology is human-made, even if it comes back and affects the human itself, is also a very specific cultural conception of the human technology relation. So, but I would like to talk with you more about this.
When we think the end of the world, we think this way, we think that is the end of the human people. Okay, do you agree with me? Okay.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, but if you have the people I don't know, I'm not
Oh,
sure. Okay?
that's a good point.
Okay, that's what we talk about. Then we live in a machine with peaceful and human people disappears. Okay,
Yeah.
I think this, I don't know, I'm not sure, I didn't search about this. But I only read and there is some people talk about AI, you know, some seminars, webinars, I read, I research some books that, okay?
Yeah.
Also,
No, that's.
I'm not sure.
I think this disappearance of the human goes back to Jeff's question of humans as a species, right? That maybe we have not addressed, or I have not addressed. When you were posing your question, I recalled an essay, a very short essay from Donna Haraway, that proposed how we can think about killing better, not only of living better or promoting life, but also as killing better. And obviously, she's not talking about the killing humans better, but some cultural prescription of talking about killing better, for instance, in our food, in other things. I think that we could also appropriate this notion of Haraway to think, how could we think about ending human species better, if it's going to end at all? If it's ultimately going to end, how we could think of ending human species better, and to think about how the human species could end in a better way. For me, it's inevitable to think about this overrepresentation of the man, because this processes, maybe it's one of the process that is causing this end of the human, this maybe inevitable end of the human species to be more dramatic, more unequal and asymmetrical than it could be. So, but just thinking out loud, okay? And the second one, I have an intuition that I disagree with you, because this is always the case. But I don't know that I can articulate in words my disagreement, my intuitive disagreement. So I'll ask for another opportunity to interact with your question.
Yeah. Let me see if I understand what you said, but you are invited us to think, what are these arrangements that make this end question an important question, and more than that, why we keep responding to this call. Am I right? Yes. Why the question of ending is something to which we keep engaging with. Is this the question? Yes, more in line. I think we will help. But I will respond to the question that I invented. And then you say to me what was the real question. But in a way, why we cannot refuse the call of this ending debate. I'm now feeling a little less enthusiastic about my response, since I know that was not the question. But I was thinking that maybe we keep being dragged attracted by this question of ending, because we are interested in, when I say we, I'm not sure if the right term, but this group that keep asking about ending, and we there respond to it, are in a cycle of repetition in around some terms that we use to talk about ending. Because to talk about ending, we have to talk about human, even if we believe that maybe the human is not the human anymore, or the world will not be the world anymore, but we are actually in a game of having the opportunity to repeat against lines. So maybe it's a trap because every time we are debating about ending, we actually end up reinforcing the terms that we can use to talk about ending. So human became again big question. The world became again a big question. The man became again a big question. So there's in a way again trapped in this idea of repeating this in a way actually make these words and lines work again, even as it quakes that we are making this to begin. Because I was just thinking why I didn't refuse to talk about ending in this roundtable. Why I didn't actually end up talking about what we can understand about human and stuff. And that made me think about most of the conservative, yes, groups and how they operate because they are all the time creating traps about some agendas that could not be important, but they launch. Today I'm so tired of nothing, but they keep making this agenda appear some very polemic and problematic agenda, and when we see our trapped in it, and feminism like debating about very unimportant stuff. But why we do that? I think that in a way we are making the wrong choices because when we do that, we are just actually making the lines of patriarchy work again. When they, for example, making very unpredictable debates like the women will disappear, something like similar to this. The world will end, the human will disappear. It's a very polemic question that we have no answer for that. But once we engage with it, that group can actually make the idea of women, whatever they think they are, and men work again. I haven't been clear. So actually, I invented a question response to it. So, just to say that I'm feeling trapped by this roundtable, I think, because in a way, I see myself ending up talking about a lot of category that we should actually maybe not use anymore. But I'm here talking about human sovereignty and man and stuff like that. So.
To say something brief. Thank you for both questions. Thank you, Jeff, for pointing out the trap. And maybe this is where I ended up in my own thinking as well, in realizing I was playing out tropes of nationalism again. I spoke a little bit about the international and thinking about Chakrabarty's book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, I think is the title. I keep mixing up the title. He has a section in that, which I'd like to go back to and unpack further, about the difference it makes to think in terms of globe, planet, world, international. Globe, planet, world, international. So perhaps we can move between some of these or think about what difference each one makes to that framing of the problem. So at the end of the world gets us in a trap. How do we think through the differences between these? And then in trying to think my own way out of the trap, partly in watching Parasite and thinking about Parasite as I try to introduce it today, the film, I found myself going back to cities. cities as my opposite to the problem and a space from which to think about politics and what is at stake, or the stakes or the issues again, rather than the endings and the worlds. Okay, that's all.
Thank you so much. We are now actually halftime afterwards. So let's, would you like to? I'm just provoking. I just want to take the opportunity to thank you all for coming tonight. Thanking most especially Victor, Lara, and Brad for sharing your thoughts with us here. And hopefully the world is not ending tonight. And thank you all for coming again. Wish you very good nights. Thank you. See you tomorrow.